Part that got me was the sleep test. Here you have Gilgamesh, a giant demigod who can shatter mountains and slaughter the bull of heaven, failing his ultimate quest for eternal life because he cannot stay awake for 6 nights and 7 days. It is an incredibly humiliating, deeply human moment that cuts right through the heroic bravado of the ancient world. We are talking about a king who ruled Erech, which we know today as the first great city of Mesopotamia. A man who possessed unmatched physical strength and courage, collapsing into a deep sleep the second he sits down on the shore. Isn't there something wonderfully comforting about that failure? It is the ancient world's way of reminding us that no matter how much power you accumulate, your biological hardware has a hard, unyielding limit. When you look at our modern tech elites, the Silicon Valley billionaires spending small fortunes on blood transfusions, hyperbaric chambers, and experimental gene therapies, you realize we are still running the exact same software. They are our modern Gilgameshes, terrified of the quiet dark, trying to build a technological bypass around the grave. They want to conquer death through code and chemistry, treating mortality as a bug to be patched rather than a feature of existence. But are they actually seeking life, or are they just running away from the terrifying reality of their own insignificance? The ancient Mesopotamians understood this panic intimately. They lived in a harsh, unpredictable floodplain where rivers changed course overnight, and they knew that the human desire to escape death is the oldest, most repeating pattern we have. To understand why this story matters, we have to look at how these early civilizations actually functioned and competed. Back in the Bronze Age, there were no hard national borders, no passports, and no rigid concepts of race or culture. People had an immense amount of autonomy. If you did not like the ruler or the taxes in one valley, you simply packed up your family and migrated to another. This meant that the early city-states were locked in a constant, high-stakes competition to attract labor to drive their economies. How do you convince a wandering tribe that your city is the absolute best place on earth to settle down? The Egyptians did it by building the pyramids, those colossal stone mountains designed to signal to everyone for miles around that their pharaohs were favored by the gods themselves. But the people of Mesopotamia had a problem, because how do you compete against the sheer physical scale of the pyramids? They tried at first by building ziggurats, which were massive, stepped mud brick temples built to house their local gods, but they soon realized they needed something different to capture the human imagination. They needed a story. So they created the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we now celebrate as the very first work of world literature. It was a brilliant, highly innovative move in what the German philosopher Friedrich Hegel called the dialectic, the historical process where opposing ideas clash to produce new ways of living. Instead of stacking millions of tons of limestone, Mesopotamia built an intellectual monument made of clay tablets and spoken words. Is a story not infinitely more portable than a stone tomb? The story begins in Erech, the first city of Mesopotamia, where Gilgamesh rules as a giant, restless demigod. He is incredibly brave and strong, but because he has no equals and gets bored easily, he turns his immense energy into terrorizing his own subjects. He picks fights with the young men, beating them to a pulp just to feel something, and he claims the right to sleep with every young woman before her wedding night. The desperate parents of the city cry out to the heavens for relief, and the gods listen. They decide to create an equal, a wild man named Enkidu, who is shaped out of raw clay and lives among the beasts of the wilderness. Do we not still see this pattern in our own institutions, where unchecked power inevitably breeds a monster that requires an external force to balance the scales? When Enkidu finally enters the city of Erech, he confronts Gilgamesh, and the two giants engage in a massive, earth-shaking wrestling match. Gilgamesh wins, but instead of executing his rival, he is filled with a sudden, overwhelming joy because he has finally found someone who can look him in the eye as an equal. They become inseparable friends, embarking on grand adventures like slaying monsters and killing the great bull of heaven sent by the angry gods. But this triumph is short-lived because their arrogance deeply angers the divine council. The gods decide that Enkidu must pay the price for their hubris, and they strike him down with a slow, agonizing disease. As Gilgamesh watches his beloved companion turn back into the cold clay from which he was made, his entire worldview shatters. For the first time in his life, the great king is terrified. He realizes that all his strength, his high walls, and his royal titles cannot protect him from the same quiet decay that took his friend. He abandons his crown, puts on filthy animal skins, and wanders into the wilderness, driven by a singular, desperate obsession. He must find a way to live forever. Along his journey, everyone he meets tells him to turn back and abandon his wild, transhumanist project. Innkeepers and travelers tell him that immortality is reserved strictly for the gods, and that he should instead go home, eat good food, wear clean clothes, and enjoy the simple pleasures of being alive. Why is it that we find it so difficult to accept this advice when we are in the grip of existential dread? Gilgamesh refuses to listen and pushes onward until he finally tracks down the one human being who has achieved physical immortality. This is an ancient, unnamed immortal man who survived the great flood that wiped out the rest of humanity. The old man explains to Gilgamesh that his immortality was a bizarre, unrepeatable accident. He tells him how the gods, annoyed by how loud and chaotic human beings had become, resolved to drown the entire world in a massive deluge. But one sympathetic god secretly warned the man, instructing him to build a giant boat to preserve his family and all the animals of the earth. How could a single, fragile family survive when the heavens themselves decided to wash the slate clean? Fortunately, the boat held, the floodwaters receded, and the man offered sacrifices that made the gods regret their reckless destruction, prompting them to grant him eternal life as a consolation prize. The immortal man looks at Gilgamesh and tells him plainly that the gods will never convene another council to grant eternal life to a king from Erech. To prove how weak Gilgamesh's mortal body truly is, the old man issues a simple challenge. If you want to conquer death, you must first conquer sleep, so try to stay awake for 6 nights and 7 days. Gilgamesh accepts, sits down on the shore, and is immediately claimed by exhaustion, sleeping continuously while the immortal man marks each passing day with a fresh loaf of bread to prove how long the king has slept. When Gilgamesh finally wakes up, he is devastated to realize he has failed the very first test. Is there a more poignant image of human limitation than a giant king staring at a row of moldy loaves, realizing his grand quest was over before it even began? Defeated and empty-handed, Gilgamesh makes the long journey back to his kingdom, but as he approaches the gates, something extraordinary happens. He looks up at the massive, gleaming brickwork of the great walls of Erech. He sees the bustling, prosperous streets, and he watches his people living in peace and security. In that quiet moment of defeat, he has a profound epiphany. He realizes that biological immortality is an illusion, a selfish distraction from the real work of being a leader. True immortality does not mean living forever in a physical body. It means building a society that endures, creating a legacy of safety and prosperity, and being remembered with love and gratitude by the people you leave behind. This realization transforms Gilgamesh from a predatory tyrant into a wise, responsible ruler. He understands that to protect his people, he cannot rely on raw physical force or vanity projects. He needs a functioning bureaucracy to manage the chaotic, everyday affairs of the city. This shift in the narrative represents the historical emergence of a bureaucratic elite in Mesopotamia, a class of scribes and administrators who helped the king bring order, stability, and prosperity to a volatile world. The king must first recognize his own hubris and become humble before he can truly serve his subjects. When a leader finally lets go of the desperate struggle for personal glory, what kind of society becomes possible? The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as a direct critique of the Egyptian model of civilization. The Mesopotamians looked at the towering stone pyramids of Egypt and saw a profound delusion. They argued that those massive monuments, built by channeling every scrap of a society's resources into a single ruler's tomb, were actually monuments to corruption, inequality, and waste. When a severe drought struck the Nile, the common people suffered immensely because all the wealth had been locked up in stone mountains. What good is a giant stone mountain if the people living in its shadow are starving to death? The Epic of Gilgamesh suggests that a pharaoh who bankrupts his kingdom to build a tomb will die a double death, because once his empire collapses, his name will be forgotten or reviled. This is where the power of literature truly begins. The Mesopotamians realized that memories can be shaped into beautiful, enduring forms that implant themselves in the minds of others for centuries. inspiring future generations to reach greater heights of achievement. You do not need to drag massive blocks of granite across the desert to survive the grave. You just need to write a story that captures the raw, aching truth of the human condition. While the wind and rain slowly wear down the physical pyramids, the story of Gilgamesh's grief and his failure has survived intact for thousands of years. Isn't it fascinating that a clay tablet can outlast a stone monument simply because people care enough to keep copying it? This pragmatic, survival-oriented mindset was forged by the brutal geography of the region. Unlike the predictable, gentle flooding of the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two great rivers of Mesopotamia, were incredibly uncooperative and violent. They changed their courses constantly, carving new paths through the plains and wiping out entire settlements without warning. To survive in this chaotic environment, the Mesopotamians had to develop highly advanced, adaptable irrigation systems. How do you build a stable life when the ground beneath your feet is constantly being reshaped by uncooperative waters? Because the land was divided into many independent, competing city-states like Sumer, which the text calls Sama, it became a vibrant hotbed of technological innovation. If one city-state came up with a brilliant new method for clearing silt from a canal, the neighboring city-state could easily copy the design and improve upon it. But this constant proximity and resource pressure also meant that the Mesopotamian city-states were almost always at war with one another. Their focus was entirely on the struggle, the exploration, and the development of innovative means to secure water and arable land. It is a striking contrast to the Indus Valley civilization, a peaceful and egalitarian society that managed to achieve great technological heights without the constant bloodshed and rigid hierarchies of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Why does human creativity so often seem to thrive in environments of intense friction and conflict rather than peace? We can see these cultural differences clearly when we compare the creation myths of Egypt and Mesopotamia. In the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation epic, the universe is born out of a savage, bloody civil war among the gods. Tiamat, the ancient mother goddess who represents the primeval salt waters and the agricultural origins of the society, goes to war with her own descendants. A younger god named Marduk, whom the text calls Mud, eventually defeats her in a brutal battle. How could a world built from the severed pieces of a defeated mother goddess ever be anything but chaotic and violent? He splits her giant body in half, using one part to fashion the high sky and the other to create the dry continents, the moon, and the stars. Once the cosmos is built, the victorious gods decide they want to rest in peace without having to till the soil or maintain the canals, so they create human beings out of clay and the blood of a slain rebel god to serve as their slaves. In this worldview, the gods are violent, unpredictable masters who demand absolute servitude, and humans must work tirelessly just to keep them happy. Contrast this with Egyptian mythology, where the gods are benevolent guardians who hand civilization, agriculture, and kingship to humans on a silver platter, requiring only respect and reverence in return. How does living under the shadow of violent, demanding gods shape a culture's attitude toward authority and work? This fundamental difference in mythology reflects the political realities of both regions. Because Egypt was a highly centralized, stable empire for long stretches of its history, the primary virtue that won the day was cleverness, political manipulation, and palace intrigue. We see a similar pattern in ancient China, with texts like Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is essentially a manual on how to trick your rivals rather than engage in direct military combat. Why do we place such a premium on clever deception when the raw power of direct confrontation seems so much simpler? In Mesopotamia, however, where city-states were locked in constant, brutal warfare, the ultimate virtues were raw bravery and physical strength. There is no room for clever trickery in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is only pure power, the courage to face a monster, and the willingness to fight to the bitter end. If you look closely at these myths, you can actually trace the historical evolution of Mesopotamian society over hundreds of years. The Enuma Elish preserves three distinct layers of historical memory within its narrative structure. First, we have Tiamat, the ancient mother goddess of life, representing the earliest, peaceful agricultural phase of the society. Then, we see the emergence of a pantheon of younger gods, representing the growth of complex urban settlements. Isn't it remarkable how a simple myth can act as a geological record of a society's shifting political power? Finally, we have the rise of Marduk, the warrior god who takes control through military victory, reflecting the rise of powerful, centralized kings who ruled through raw force during times of constant warfare. When we bring this back to our own time, the parallels are almost uncanny. We live in an age dominated by tech elites who have built vast digital empires, much like the high walls of Erech. They have conquered the markets, accumulated unimaginable wealth, and now, like Gilgamesh, they find themselves bored and terrified of their own mortality. They fund ambitious transhumanist ventures, hoping to upload their consciousness to the cloud or use biotechnology to stall the aging process indefinitely. But are they not making the same mistake that Gilgamesh made before his long journey home? They are chasing a biological escape hatch while the social fabric of the communities around them begins to fray and decay. The genius of the Mesopotamian scribes was in recognizing that the quest for physical immortality is a dead end. Gilgamesh failed his sleep test, and he returned to his city empty-handed, yet he achieved the very thing he was looking for because his story has survived for over 4,000 years. He became immortal not by escaping death, but by embracing his humanity, humbling himself, and building a world where his people could thrive. If our modern leaders want to leave a lasting legacy, shouldn't they stop looking for ways to live forever in private bunkers and start looking at the walls of the cities they are building? The part that got me was how a simple, embarrassing failure like falling asleep can teach us more about legacy than all the monuments in the world. In the end, the only real way to survive the grave is to build something that others will love enough to remember. Do you think our modern search for technological immortality is just another hubristic delusion, or will we finally find a way to succeed where the great king of Erech failed?